We are kind of coming in the last week of our big focus on nervous system. So we'll go through autonomic nervous system today, talk about the two branches of that, and look at some similarities and differences. So we've got the parasympathetic and then the sympathetic. And so those are the two components of the autonomic. And so the autonomic is kind of considered a parallel type of system in our nervous system to the somatic. So again, we've talked about somatic a lot. That's the stuff that we're aware of, that we can initiate action, movement on, or we feel certain things in our body. And then the autonomic is kind of all of our autopilot stuff that we don't necessarily have control over and are usually not that aware of how they're working and how they're responding. All right, so let me share my screen here. And hopefully, let me pull up my chat. Get everybody admitted. All right, now I think I'm good. Let me mark those folks that just popped in. All right, so I think we're just missing two that I think. Now there's Lisa. All right, now I promise I'm going to start, unless somebody else pops in to another room. All right, so let me bop up to here. So again, somatic nervous system, we've kind of already talked about a fair amount. We went over in lab the eye and the ear structure last week. So those are our sensory organs that give us information about the outside world. We perceive that information, we're aware of it. Certainly some parts of our vision and our hearing to a lesser extent do work, have some autonomic function. When we think about the eye, when we're in control of it, let's say we're reading a book or reading a passage on an internet page or something like that, we're directing and controlling which direction our eyes move. We're clearly focusing on that object that's a foot or two in front of us, and so we're going to change the lens shape to adapt to that. The pupil diameter is going to adapt to that, and so the lens shape, pupil diameter, those things kind of have a dual control in a way. We have some ability for the autonomic nervous system to control those things. If we think about pupil diameter, it's mostly geared towards how much light there is. But certainly if we're in a crisis situation when our sympathetic nervous system would tend to kick in, we'll usually dilate a little bit so that we can make sure that we're seeing everything really clearly. So we do have, and then when we think about just maintaining the function of the eye, we need to make tears, we need to blink on a regular basis to keep that lubrication going. And those are things that, again, the blinking, we can control it, but we can also just not think about it, and we're going to blink when our eye feels like it needs it, based on that sensory information of how dry it is, how much we need to kind of recirculate some of those tears that we've been creating to keep everything moist and lubricated. So some of those organs do have autonomic function, but again, the main purpose of the eye, the main purpose of the ear is to make us aware of what's going on in the outside world. And then same thing with our sense of smell, our sense of touch. Those things also are mostly about helping us understand what's going on around us. Again, autonomic nervous system is mostly concerned with homeostasis, and homeostasis is just maintaining balance between all the different body systems. When we think about fueling the body, when we think about getting rid of waste products, when we think about bringing in the nutrients that we need, oxygen that we need, changing blood pressures depending on if we're upright, if we're lying down, all those kind of things that just need to take place, but we don't need to be in charge of them. So that's our autonomic. So that's our primary focus for the day. So when we look at kind of how they're organized, we kind of looked at how that spinal cord is arranged last week and the week before. On the somatic side, we're going to get sensory information coming in from the skin, from the joints, from the muscles, that help us understand what's going on in our body and whether the body needs to react to it. It's going to feed into that posterior root ganglia where we've got a cell body there. That axon is going to continue, and then it's going to synapse in the posterior horn of that spinal cord, whichever level it comes in at. And then you're typically going to have another neuron right there, an interneuron that's usually more than one at least, that's going to send that information up to our brain so that our thalamus can recognize where it needs to go, and then our body can sense, oh, that tension that I'm feeling is in my big toe or wherever it is. But there's usually going to be interneurons at that level in the spinal cord that are also going to send a stimulus to the muscle, the motor neuron that controls the muscle fibers that we're trying to react if we need to move in response to that stimulus or something along those lines. So it's essentially, we've got really just the one neuron in the periphery that's on the sensory side, the one neuron in the periphery that's on the motor side. When we look at our autonomic nervous system, with one exception, we have two motor neurons in the periphery. So a little bit different from the somatic in that respect. In this image for the autonomic, we've got the lungs pictured there. So our lungs, when we're breathing, we're going to feel how much stretch the lung tissue is under, and that's going to send a stimulus so that we know kind of when we need to quit breathing in and when we can start to exhale. And then kind of the same thing on the other end of the respiratory cycle. When our lungs get really empty, then we're going to also sense that there's not much tension on those tissues and it's time to breathe again. That's going to be working in conjunction with the receptors that sense carbon dioxide and oxygen concentrations. And so those things are also going to play a role in how often we're breathing. But when we look at just the lung tissue itself, it's mostly responding to how much stretch it's under. So if we get this stretch on that tissue that tells us that we've inhaled a certain amount, we've got the same setup in that we've got a peripheral neuron in that posterior root ganglia. It's going to proceed into the posterior horn of that spinal cord. These autonomic sensory neurons are usually a little bit more proximal. If you think about our little H, at the tip of that posterior horn is going to be where the somatic sensory neurons are located. And then closer to where the crossbar is in that H, that's kind of but it's still in the posterior horn, is more where the visceral sensory neuron are going to be located. So it is a distinctly different area in that posterior horn within that gray matter, that spinal cord. Similarly, when we send that signal out on the motor side, those motor neurons in the somatic system, the ones that we can control, are in the anterior horn. They're at the more distal part of that H, but again, kind of at the bottom in this image that we're seeing. The visceral motor neurons are going to be more in the lateral horn. So a little bit more proximal within that H, closer to that gray commissure that connects the two sides of that gray matter inside that spinal cord. When we have that motor neuron in the autonomic side in that lateral horn, it's going to go out its anterior root, I should say. It's going to continue usually along the same pathway as the somatic motor neurons to a point. And then in most cases, it's going to synapse in another ganglia. So we have this is our second peripheral neuron in the autonomic system on the motor side. So we've got the one in the spinal cord, and then we've got another one in this ganglia. And so a lot of this is showing the sympathetic ganglia, the sympathetic trunk. These are right outside the spinal cord. So if we look at my skeleton here, we've got our spinal cord right here. We've essentially got at each level, you're going to have a row of cell bodies of ganglia that are clustered, essentially linked, where each spinal nerve is coming out on the posterior side. It's going to connect into this grouping of neurons that are right there. So again, and they're going to run parallel on either side of just in front of that spinal cord. So they're going to be well protected by the rib cage because they're inside the rib cage, and they're basically behind all of our internal organs. So when we think about our stomach and our liver and our intestines and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be behind those things, but in front of the actual vertebral bodies, and kind of right at the junction of where the ribs are running into the vertebrae. Is kind of where these clusters of cell bodies are. Other ganglia are located a little bit differently, and so we'll kind of look at how everything is organized. This is just one particular type of setup that we see with the sympathetic. So that's kind of structurally how things are organized. And again, in the somatic nervous system, single motor neuron. In the autonomic nervous system, we're going to have 2 motor neurons in that periphery. And so we'll typically refer to those 2 neurons. The first one that is inside the spinal cord that is sending its axon out the spinal nerve is going to be the preganglionic neuron. And then you're going to have that ganglia. And so then the neurons that are located inside that ganglia, whether it's right next to the spinal cord or a little bit closer to whatever organ it's innervating, are termed the ganglionic neuron, sometimes called the postganglionic neuron, and it's really the postganglionic refers to the axon. So we have a preganglionic axon that's traveling essentially from the neuron in the spinal cord to the ganglia. It's going to synapse with a neuron in the ganglia, and then that axon from the ganglionic neuron is then going to go to innervate whatever it needs to, whether that's a blood vessel, whether that's the intestine, whether that's the heart, wherever it's going to go. So that's kind of how we refer to those 2 neurons. Again, when we look at the spinal cord, or when we look at the somatic nervous system, we're going to have our upper motor neuron is the one in the brain, and then the lower motor neuron is the one in the spinal cord. So we kind of have these distinct terms that we use depending on which part of the nervous system we're in, either the somatic or the autonomic. So with our preganglionic neurons, those axons are always myelinated. So they have a little bit faster carrying capacity. They can send that message a little bit quicker. It's going to reach the ganglia, and then the postganglionic neurons, for whatever reason, are always going to be unmyelinated. So that connection is a little bit slower. We have to depolarize along that whole axon versus just depolarizing in the gaps between the insulation of that myelin. So a little different setup. The other thing that's shown on this slide are which specific neurotransmitter is being released at these different ganglia. And so with our, the preganglionic neuron is always going to release acetylcholine at the ganglion. Now, acetylcholine is the same neurotransmitter that the somatic motor neurons are going to release to stimulate muscle fiber contraction. So that is, I think it's the most common neurotransmitter in the body, but it's definitely not the only one. So ACH refers to acetylcholine. Over here on the right, we've got the second axon, that postganglionic axon. It's going to release a neurotransmitter at its target organ. So whether that's a blood vessel, the intestine, the stomach, the lungs, whatever. And it will release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. And so norepinephrine is essentially a very similar compound to epinephrine chemically. And that's our primary excitatory messenger that we use in the sympathetic nervous system. Norepinephrine and epinephrine can be classified as a neurotransmitter when they're released at a synapse like this. But we'll talk a little bit later about the adrenal gland, and everybody's heard that phrase, you get a rush of adrenaline or things like that. When we talk about a rush of adrenaline, that's essentially epinephrine and or norepinephrine that's causing that excitatory stimulation. And so when the adrenal gland releases norepinephrine, it's the same chemical that's being released at these synapses, but instead of causing a direct effect right on the tissue where it's released, when it is released from the adrenal gland, it's going to go into the circulation, flow throughout the body, and then wherever there are receptors that respond to it, it's going to cause a stimulatory effect in those tissues too. So things that function, there are certain chemicals that function both as a hormone that get released into the bloodstream and cause an effect wherever they make contact with a receptor for that chemical, or if it's a neurotransmitter, it means it's basically being released at a synapse to either pass a message on by exciting the next neuron or by trying to suppress a message by inhibiting that neuron. So we've got kind of a couple different ways that some of these chemicals can work. And we'll kind of keep revisiting which specific types release the acetylcholine at that second synapse and which ones are going to release the norepinephrine and how that's going to work. So I mentioned earlier we have within the autonomic nervous system, we have both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic only uses acetylcholine. So it's really just the sympathetic side that would potentially be using that norepinephrine. But the sympathetic also can use acetylcholine. So it is a little confusing. At our first synapse, the acetylcholine is always excitatory. So when it is released, if it's released in a large enough amount, it is going to cause the next neuron, the one in the ganglia, to become excited and also depolarize to pass the message on. When we get to the end of the second axon, then that's at the target tissue. It depends on what type of receptor we have and what effect we're after. But sometimes the acetylcholine will inhibit and sometimes it will excite. So the second one, it's not always going to necessarily make that action take place. Sometimes we might want to not cause that action to take place by releasing it. So a little bit different on that second receptor site. And hopefully it'll make more sense as we kind of talk about examples in the body of how these things are going to work. And we'll look at the general phrase that are often associated with parasympathetic versus sympathetic nervous system. And so parasympathetic is often referred to as the rest and digest part. So really, that's really our key homeostasis. Things that need to happen correctly to keep our body in balance is really the parasympathetic side of things. The sympathetic is known as our fight or flight response. And so that's more of our stress response. If we're we're hiking and a bear is right there around the corner, we're going to get a big sympathetic nervous system response. If you're home at night and all of a sudden somebody starts pounding on the door, you're like, I wasn't expecting anybody, you're going to get a sympathetic nervous system response. When somebody cuts you off in traffic and you get road rage, you're getting a sympathetic nervous system response. Your heart's going to start pounding, you're going to get agitated, you're going to potentially get kind of sweaty, you're going to be kind of nervous, kind of shaking, things like that. Essentially, that sympathetic response is trying to prepare your body to best be able to either escape the situation that you're in by fleeing the flight part or by defending yourself in some way. Whereas, again, the parasympathetic side is going to just keep things going. We just want to let all these normal body functions happen, whether we're talking about something like digesting food, producing urine, regulating the menstrual cycle. All of those type of things are going to be just regular breathing, regular heart rate. All that stuff is going to be parasympathetic controlled. So the two systems are set up a little bit differently by having this 2-neuron pathway in the motor side of things. It gives the body a better ability to have one signal that is dispersed widely, what we call neuronal divergence. And that's most typically what we'll see with the sympathetic side of things. If we are in a panic situation, we kind of want to let all the body systems know about it right away so that we can respond appropriately. The parasympathetic side uses more of this neuronal convergence so that it can cause more selective effects. Just because I ate a lot doesn't mean I also need some other body function to be ramped up in activity too. I need more attention going to the digestive tract if I've just eaten, and I don't need the same amount of excitatory messaging going on for the lungs, let's say. just because I ate. Yeah, there is going to be a little bit greater need for oxygen use and a little bit more CO2 produced by the GI tract, but it's nothing like if we were exercising as far as that's concerned. So the neuronal convergence gives us the ability to kind of more discreetly control, especially what's going on in the parasympathetic side. But the neuronal divergence is much more about just alerting lots of stuff with one message so that we can have a synchronized kind of response. And that's kind of what the sympathetic is all about. All right, so I kind of mentioned these terms already. So the rest and digest is our parasympathetic, our fight or flight is our sympathetic. So hopefully this video is going to play. I think it's about 8 or 9 minutes long, and he'll review everything, kind of some of the stuff that I've talked about and some of the stuff that we're going to go over in just the rest of the class. So I did have some issues with this yesterday, trying to get it to open. So I'm hopeful that it will open correctly for me this time. But YouTube hasn't been my friend lately. Probably because I don't subscribe and pay anything and stuff like that. And we'll probably get an ad too, if it plays. This is promising.
No matter what you're a fan of, you can probably think of two characters who fit the description. Holmes and Watson, Brennan and Booth, Kirk and Spock, Ron and Hermione. They're close, they understand each other in ways that others don't, and you really can't picture one without the other. But when stuff happens, they usually react in different ways. Like if you're snooping around Hogwarts at night and you come across some beastie, the smart money's on Hermione to come up with a spell that saves the day, while Ron probably standing there with his mouth open. And when Sherlock starts to go crazy because there hasn't been a fiendishly clever jewel heist or whatever for him to figure out, you can count on Watson to calm him down. Mostly. My brother John, who is a writer of books, will tell you that these characters are foils. They're not opposites exactly, they're contrasts, and the more you see them together, the more they seem to complement or round one another out. And that is basically your autonomic nervous system in a nutshell. Your autonomic system is the branch of your peripheral nervous system that regulates the functions of your internal organs, like your heart and stomach, and also controls your smooth and cardiac muscles, and your glands. All things that you do not consciously control, so yes, you could say it has a lot of power over you. But the funny, or maybe confusing thing about this system is that its effects on your organs and muscles and glands are by no means consistent. Not at all. At any given moment, whether you happen to be totally relaxed or completely flipping your wig, your autonomic system is constantly making involuntary, fine-tuned adjustments to your body based on what signals your central nervous system is picking up. This could mean changing your body temperature, sending extra blood to a particular area, slowing your heartbeat, or tweaking your stomach secretions. Its effects change depending on the situation you're in, and also which part of your autonomic system is in charge at that moment. Because this weird little corner of your nervous system that keeps you alive is actually run by two competing interests. Two divisions that serve the same organs, but they create opposite effects in them, battling it out back and forth to either excite your body's functions or subdue them. One of them is dedicated to amping you up and preparing you for activity, that's your sympathetic nervous system, and the other one talks you down and effectively undoes what its foil did, and that is the parasympathetic nervous system. Together, they are what make your body experience stress, fear, relaxation, and defiance, courage and cowardice, panic and peace. If there's an epic novel going on in your body right now, it is probably being written by these two. Let's talk about names for a minute. One of the two divisions of your autonomic nervous system is called the sympathetic system. That sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? It's like understanding and calming and telling you that it's not so bad after all. Wrong! Contrary to its comforting name, the sympathetic system is what sounds your internal alarm bells. It's the hardware behind the famous fight or flight response. It is synonymous with stress. If the sympathetic is for fight or flight, the parasympathetic is for resting and digesting. It's responsible for maintaining your body and conserving energy for later. I recognize recognize that this is confusing. But when you explore the anatomy of these two systems, like we're going to do today, they start to make a little more sense. Because even though their basic components are essentially the same, their physical structures turn out to be different in a few really important ways. And those differences can help explain why they act like the foils that they are, and why sometimes you feel more like Sherlock than Watson, or the other way around. First big difference, the nerves of these two divisions originate at different sites in your body. Your sympathetic fibers are thoracolumbar, meaning that they originate from between your thoracic vertebra, where your ribs attach, and the lumbar vertebra just inferior to your ribs. Early anatomists saw how a network of nerves radiating from the middle of the spine like this could quickly coordinate the functions of many major organs at once, so it was called the sympathetic system, from the Greek words for feeling together. But the nerve fibers of your parasympathetic system begin both above and below where the sympathetic ones do. They're craniosacral, meaning they sprout from the base of your brain and also from your sacral spinal cord, just superior to the tailbone. And because the roots of these nerve fibers basically frame the starting points of the sympathetic nerves, they were called parasympathetic, literally beside the sympathetic. Another difference between these two foils? They're ganglia. Unlike your sensory or motor neurons, where a single axon can reach all the way from your spinal cord to whatever muscle or touch receptor it works with, both parts of your autonomic system require two neurons in order to work. And those two neurons meet in ganglia, clusters of neuron cell bodies that house millions of synapses. But where these ganglia appear relate to their function and which division of the autonomic system they're serving. Sympathetic ganglia are found closer to the spinal cord because in those fight-or-flight moments of high excitement or activity, they need to be able to send a single message far and wide, like the bat signal. This way, excitatory signals traveling into a ganglion near the spine, ganglion being the singular of ganglia, can trigger action potentials in a whole bunch of other neurons that lead to many different effectors, like the heart and lungs and stomach and adrenal glands. By contrast, most parasympathetic ganglia are found way out from the spine, near or even inside of their effector organs. Because this system is responsible for taking care of particular functions only when you have the time and energy to do it, like digesting food or excreting waste, it uses more specific strategic signals. It's more like Commissioner Gordon calling Batman on the bat phone one-on-one just to talk about how things are going and, whether Alfred's doing okay after his meningitis. It's private conversation. Not everybody needs to be involved. Anyway, because the ganglia of these two divisions appear in different places in your body, it also makes sense that their neurons themselves have slightly different forms, namely the length of their axons. Now, ganglia can be kind of complex. It actually comes from the Greek word for a knot in a string, so when dealing with neurons around these structures, we look at the fibers before they run into the ganglion as well as after they come out of it. Understandably enough, the axon lengths of the neurons before the ganglion are called the preganglionic fibers, and the ones coming out are postganglionic. The key here is that in the sympathetic system, the preganglionic fibers are much shorter than the postganglionic ones, which makes sense when you think about it because the sympathetic ganglia are really close to the spinal cord and the axons don't have or need very far to go from the central nervous system. But they do have a lot of distance to cover on the other side of the ganglion in order to reach their effectors, so naturally the fibers leading out of the ganglia are a lot longer. And foils being what they are, the reverse is of course true for the parasympathetic system. Since parasympathetic ganglia are so close to or even inside of their effector organs, the preganglionic fibers are a lot longer. They extend from the cranium and sacrum, where they start, out to the lungs or liver or bladder, wherever their effector is, where they reach their ganglion. From there, the postganglionic fibers are super short, just long enough to communicate with their effector. So once again, it's anatomy and physiology. The structure of each of these systems is related to its function. The sympathetic nervous system is set up in such a way that even a small stress signal sent down one path could trigger a response in many effectors at once, which is one reason why your reaction to a sudden stressful event can feel so all-encompassing. By the same token, the resting and digesting that's overseen by the parasympathetic system doesn't require urgent, all-hands-on-deck communication. If you need to process a burrito or take a nap or maybe a trip to the bathroom, it can communicate with the organs involved one-on-one. But still, none of this tells us how these systems do what they do, how these nerves communicate with your organs and muscles and glands in times of either stress or relaxation. We'll start that next week with a white-knuckle ride through your sympathetic nervous system, so between now and then, rest up. For now, you'll learn the basic two-part system of your autonomic nervous system, mainly that it consists of two primary...
All right. Thanks, Hank. So we're not going to watch this.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So the ganglion is a junction box?
Pretty much, yeah. Just where a lot of wiring is going to be able to kind of connect with each other and branch out from there to go where it needs to go. So
What
yeah,
is it? What is the efficiency of that? Why wouldn't you just have a direct connection?
Again, when we looked at it, it mostly has to do, I think, with the divergence and the convergence part. By having, it's kind of like if you think about airlines, they're going to have a hub. It's just more efficient to have large hubs that then you can send flights out that connect to smaller cities from. So maybe kind of similar to that. I mean, like Delta has a hub here in Salt Lake, another hub in Atlanta on the other side of the country. But if you're going to reach, any number of places on the East Coast, almost everything's going to connect through Atlanta. If you're going west, almost everything's going to connect through Salt Lake for those flights. So it's just a way to make those connections easier, I think, whether we're trying to have a big flight that then can disembark people to a lot of different places, divergence, or whether you have a lot of people that say want to go to New York City, but they're coming from all over on the West Coast. Well, let's bring them all over to this one place, and then we can have one plane go from New York or go from Salt Lake to New York, something like that. So it mostly helps, I think, with just the organization of it when we're trying to either have a lot of information influence one target organs by converging on it, on the ganglia that controls it, or by, with the sympathetic, if there's trouble, we want everything to know about that trouble at the same time. So we want one primary message to go lots of places and cause this widespread effect. So I think that's kind of the main reason why we're kind of organized that way. All right, so if you like that video series, I do like them. I think they're really good. I'll use them again next semester when we go into physiology. But if you're interested in looking for them, it's a crash course. And like I said, the sympathetic one, we're not going to watch. But if you find it helpful and you want to watch that, feel free to pull it up. All right, so he talked about the axon differences. And again, in the sympathetic side, because that first neuron is just going from the spinal cord to that, what we call the sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain. And those ganglia are literally just an inch or two away from where the cell body is. Those are a very short axon. And then you're going to have that neuron that's right on the side of the spinal cord that's then going to have a much longer axon. It's going to be way more than an inch or two. The parasympathetic is just the opposite. The neuron that's in the spinal cord itself is going to exit out and go all the way to basically to the heart, to the lungs, to the intestines. Sometimes they don't go all the way to the organ. They go very close to the organ, and then you're going to have a ganglia there that sends a shorter axon to the organ that we're trying to influence. So preganglionic axons are short in the sympathetic and long in the parasympathetic. Postganglionic axons are just the opposite. They're going to be long in sympathetic and short in parasympathetic. So that's definitely important to remember. And again, the sympathetic ganglia, with a couple exceptions, are mostly going to be very close to the spinal cord. So very short. All right, so the other way that those two divisions are often talked about are kind of by location wise. Craniosacral is our parasympathetic, and then thoracolumbar. And so we do have a number of cranial nerves that come out and control parasympathetic function for different organs. And then we don't really have any dedicated parasympathetic axons and cell bodies coming out in that thoracic level of the spinal cord or in the lumbar level. It's not until we get down to the sacral level that we have another set of ganglia that are controlling autonomic functions there. And the reason we don't really need any, even though we do have a ton of organs in that thoracic level and the lumbar level, if we think about our stomach, our esophagus, our liver, our pancreas, we do have a ton of organs in that thoracic area, but the vagus nerve, this cranial nerve number 10, it's a cranial nerve, so it's high up, but it has very long branches that go to all those internal organs. So the parasympathetic stimulation for those is coming from way up here, from that cranial nerve 10 with all those different branches. The ones that are down here that are controlled in that sacral region are going to be the organs that are located down there. So when we think about reproductive organs, having them maintain their homeostatic functions, whether it's testes making sperm cells, whether it's the ovaries, releasing different hormones to control the different phases of the menstrual cycle. Bladder control is going to be at that level. Bowel control is going to be at that level. Again, craniosacral is our parasympathetic, and then sympathetic is going to be that thoracolumbar, because that's really where all those spinal nerves are coming out. So we'll kind of look at each of those a little bit here as we go. I think we start with parasympathetic. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, and then we'll be able to kind of skip through some of the text stuff. So hopefully it'll kind of make sense. So they've removed all that pesky skeleton, so we just see the nervous system in this case. And so we'll look at these 4 cranial nerves that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So cranial nerve 3, which one is that?
Eyes.
Okay, so it is eyes, but which eyes? We got a couple different eyes. Yep.
That oculomotor.
So oculomotor. So when we think about oculomotor, parasympathetic isn't going to control which way we're moving the eyes. It's going to be more about that pupil dilation and constriction is going to be kind of the primary thing there. How much light is there available? I need to accommodate and create homeostasis in the eyes so it can function and see. So that's why, when you go into let's say you go from a lighter room into a darker room, if you don't turn on the light, it takes a little while, but your eyes can adapt and you can start seeing things more clearly, because that pupil's going to dilate to let in much more light, so that the rods and cones in the back of your eye are going to be able to sense at least a little bit of what's going on. But when you first walk in there, it's just, you can't see anything, because you came in from maybe you came in from outside, or you came in from a lit room into a dark closet that doesn't have any windows or something like that. The 7th nerve, so what's the 7th nerve?
Facial.
So facial, we've got both sensory and motor functions with the facial nerve. These are going to be the motor functions, because again, it's parasympathetic. So we're trying to cause some effect leading to homeostasis. So we've got one branch that's going up here to the lacrimal duct, and I think probably also triggers some mucus secretion in the sinuses too. But when we look at maintaining homeostasis of the eye, we need to produce tears. So that parasympathetic branch of the motor part of cranial nerve 7 is going to help us make tears so that we can lubricate the eye and keep it healthy. We've got another branch here that's coming off that's going to these salivary glands underneath the tongue. So we're going to also, if you think about that term rest and digest for the parasympathetic, if we're eating, we need to make saliva. If we want to keep our mouth at a healthy state, we need to make saliva. So those are going to be one of the nerves that's going to trigger salivary gland release as well. We've got cranial nerve 9. So which one is 9?
Glossopharyngeal.
Okay, so we've got our glossopharyngeal. So again, another one that's under the tongue, near the tongue and the throat. And in this case, among its functions, it's going to help with salivary gland secretion, a different salivary gland than the one that comes from the facial nerve, but still the same action essentially. And then we get to the most important one of these really, when we look at the parasympathetic side, we've got that number 10, which is our vagus. And you can see all these branches. So all of these are representing axons that are traveling out to these different organs to cause some sort of effect on that organ. And if we think about rest and digest, when we're going to the heart, it's going to essentially lower the rate and lower the force of contraction. If we're in a resting phase, the heart needs to work, but it doesn't need to work overtime. It can basically, this is its rest break. So it's going to basically send a message that says, hey, slow down, don't work so hard. You're not really doing much. There's no need to pump all that blood. So it's essentially an inhibitory effect on the heart. Same thing with the trachea and the lungs. It's going to be an inhibitory effect. You're going to get a little bit of mucus secretion in the lungs because we kind of need to keep the lungs in the right moisture state. But as far as the mechanics of breathing, the parasympathetic side is going to slow things down. We don't need to breathe as deeply if we're at rest. We don't need to breathe as often as if we're at rest. We can still maintain balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide without really breathing hard. So again, inhibitory effect with those things. When we look at these ones that are going to all of these digestive tract organs, on the other hand, rest and digest, we need to get busy. We need to digest. So when we do eat something, we're going to get the physical stimulus of, hey, there's something in my gut. I feel stretch on those tissues. Let's start secreting some stuff. Let's start getting that smooth muscle contracting so that we can start digesting, breaking apart those food items into small enough pieces that we can absorb them across the gut wall. So the parasympathetic side is going to be excitatory for these digestive organs, at least when there's a stimulus like food or liquid being introduced into those organs. Or potentially if we need to go to the bathroom, if we need to eliminate, either because the kidney recognizes, hey, there's too much fluid in the body, let's start making some urine. And then that kidney is going to send that urine to the bladder. The bladder is going to send a message saying, hey, I'm full, it's time to empty me. Or you've digested food and it gets down to the end of the road in the digestive tract, and you get the sensation that, hey, I need to go number two. And so again, it's excitatory messages for that GI tract as well as for the urinary tract. When we look at the reproductive organs, the effects of the parasympathetic are typically going to be excitatory as well. Again, it's trying to just help those organs do their job so that when they are needed to help make a new human, they've already done the background work to be ready for that. So in the case of the men, they will have already made sperm cells. So then if there is the need to release those to try and impregnate the partner, then they're viable and they're ready. And then on the female side, again, we look at just the regulation of the menstrual cycle. There's a lot of hormones that go involved in that, but those hormones are going to definitely influence and interact with the activity of these pelvic nerves that are going to innervate those organs down there. So again, for the most part, with the exception of the heart and the lungs, where the effects are inhibitory, most of these other organs that are getting innervated by cranial nerve 10 in particular are going to be excitatory, because the rest and digest part, that's what the parasympathetic does. So we'll kind of look at the sympathetic side next. So those the nerves that run to the bladder, the lower bowel, the reproductive organs in particular, we refer to those as pelvic splanchnic nerves. So that's not part of the vagus. That's part of that sacral division of the craniosacral or parasympathetic system. And this term splanchnic, just kind of, my understanding of it is it just kind of refers to the gut. So you'll see that term used a lot in some other places too. So don't be thrown by it. It just refers to some nerves that are located kind of in that gut region, somewhere in that abdominal cavity. And again, you're going to have individual specific nerve branches that cause effects in the bladder, that cause effects in the ovary, that cause effects in the testes, that cause effect in the rectum, in the bowel. But you don't need to know any specifics on which of those nerves does which function. Just know that those things are controlled by these pelvic splanchnic nerves. They're sacral division of the parasympathetic. All right, so let's look at our sympathetic. Again, our thoracolumbar. So all those are nerves, spinal nerves that are coming out at either between the thoracic vertebrae or between the lumbar vertebrae. And we have about 4 different ways that these messages and these wiring systems can kind of be set up. So we'll kind of look at each of those different ways as we go through there. But let's look at our kind of our big picture, like we did on the last diagram for parasympathetic. So we've got our sympathetic chain ganglia or sympathetic trunk. That's this row. It kind of looks like a string of pearls or something on either side, where we've got this more rounded section where the ganglia is. Again, lots and lots of neurons at each one of those ganglia. Coming off the top in that thoracic area, we have a few that are considered cervical ganglia. So they're actually kind of above that T1 level, but they still are considered part of this thoracolumbar division. Again, we're going to control eye function. We've got blood vessels and sweat glands. And then we have branches going to the heart and going to the lungs. So when we look at the eye, when we have a sympathetic stimulation, that's fight or flight. So we're in a dangerous situation. We're not usually like trying to thread a needle where we need to look up really close. If there's danger around us, we want big picture. We want our focus to be off in the distance so that we can see that mountain lion as it's approaching, so that we can identify if I'm in a field of battle or something like that. I can identify that I've got enemy fire coming from all these different positions. If you're playing a sport, you want to have that big picture view so you can kind of have a sense of where all your opponents are on the field, so you know how to react to avoid them or to intercept them, depending on if you're the offensive or defensive player. So we want kind of the opposite of what we see with parasympathetic. With parasympathetic, we're going to usually cause vasodilation, or excuse me, vasoconstriction a lot of times, so that we can kind of see up close. With sympathetic, we want more kind of let more light in, let that lens be a little bit flatter, so that it is going to show us the things in the distance more clearly. We're not trying to look up close, we're trying to look far away with that. With blood vessels and sweat glands, these are going to be excitatory messages. We want the blood vessels are kind of interesting. They're largely just respond to sympathetic stimulation, and in most cases it will cause constriction, because it's going to cause contraction of the smooth muscle if we excite it. We really want dilation of some of these blood vessels. So if I'm in sympathetic nervous system situation where I really need my body to be able to do a lot of work, to escape, to fight, I'm going to be generating a lot of heat from that extra activity of fighting or fleeing. And so we want the blood vessels in our skin to dilate so we can send more blood to the skin so that it's easier for us to make sweat, and it's easier for heat to just radiate off of our body. We're also going to dilate the blood vessels to our muscles, because our muscles need a lot of blood to run away, to fight, whatever we're doing. Where we don't need much blood is in the GI tract. If I've just eaten lunch, or I just drank a quart of water, and all of a sudden I'm under attack, the priority is get me out of this dangerous situation, send the blood to the skin so I can stay cool and keep fighting longer, send the blood to the muscles so I can keep running or fighting. Don't worry about digesting lunch. Don't worry about making urine. Don't worry about making sperm cells or worrying about the next phase of ovulation. Now's not the time. And so that sympathetic nervous system, when we are under attack and we need it, it's great to have. The problem that we have in much of our society now is that people get ramped up about stuff that doesn't warrant getting that big time sympathetic response. You get cut off in traffic and you get all enraged and you're screaming at the car and pounding on this and that, and it's not going to have an effect. You're not going to, other than maybe get yourself shot by the other driver, you're not really going to do anything good of it, but you're raising your blood pressure. You're cycling that thought through in your mind over and over again, and it kind of keeps that sympathetic stimulation and the release of these excitatory hormones elevated, and it's not a good thing. I watched a video that I used to use in a health and wellness class that I taught at my last school, and the woman that was narrating the video was like, this is designed to be fight or flight, but all too often in our society now, it's really stew and chew. So you get ticked off about something, you get mad, and then to calm yourself down, you go get a snack and get some comfort food, or you go get a drink that's going to make you feel good or whatever. And so these are not good coping strategies. When we have that big sympathetic response, the way to help bring those things back to balance is to engage in physical activity. that's what it's being released for, so that we can fight or flight or flee. And so if we just keep it inside, then it just kind of doesn't let those hormones dissipate as quickly, and it has a lot of negative effects, especially related to high blood pressure, and some of the other hormones that can be released when we're under constant stress. And certainly there are cases of women who should be in their childbearing years that will lose their menstrual cycle if they're under chronic stress, because they're releasing all these sympathetic hormones too much, and it blunts the effectiveness of the parasympathetic hormones and the parasympathetic signaling that's trying to just regulate that normal homeostatic function. So these things, it's good that we have it when we need it, but we don't want to overuse it. We don't want to call it into play when the situation really doesn't warrant it. So again, we've got when we look at the heart and the lungs, again, this is when we need those things to ramp up their activity. So sympathetic nervous system is going to make that heart beat faster. It's going to make it beat more strongly. And that's why, like, if you're in a near car wreck, you can literally feel your heart pounding in your chest because it's beating super forcefully. You're getting this huge sympathetic stimulus that, even though we're not physically moving, we were almost killed. And so we just have this involuntary response that says, hey, release all this stuff, be ready to fight. Or maybe your car's going to catch on fire and you need to run and escape. So we definitely want these two organs to ramp up their activity, but all these GI tract organs, reproductive organs, we're going to turn them down when we get sympathetic. We don't really, that's a lesser priority. We need the things that are going to help us move and fight when we turn on that sympathetic side. So when we look at how these things are organized, again, we'll kind of go through these 4 ways that the sympathetic is set up in just a sec. So we've got these ones that have cell bodies in the sympathetic chain ganglia right along here that, again, are going to the eye, sweat glands, blood vessels, heart, lungs to ramp those things up. When we are trying to influence the activity of the reproductive organs and the GI tract organs, we don't need that to be as coordinated of a response. So it's not tied into that same sympathetic chain that we see with the ones that are actually going to help us fight. They're going to have a separate ganglia that is still close to the spinal cord, but it's just a little bit anterior. So if we look at my skeleton, the sympathetic trunk ones are coming here. These other ones, the axons are going to come out a little bit, but they're not going to go all the way to the stomach or all the way to the intestine. They're going to go a little bit away from the spinal cord, but they're still, think of them as still being closer to the spinal cord than they are to the organ that they're going to innervate. So we do still have that shorter preganglionic axon for all these sympathetic systems and a longer postganglionic axon. And so that's kind of what's shown over here. These brown ones are meant to be the preganglionic axon, and then the green ones are the postganglionic axons on the diagram. And we do have a number of different that are named ganglia that control these different organs. You don't need to know the names of them, I don't think, and which ones specifically control anything. These are what are sometimes referred to as prevertebral, pre meaning in front of. So these are prevertebral ganglia that, again, are controlling mostly all these digestive organs. And then the one that's most unique that doesn't actually have a ganglia is this one that comes over here to the adrenal gland. So if we look kind of through T5 through T9, we've got all these different branches that merge. They come into this celiac ganglion. There's a branch that stays brown coming along the top. So that's telling you in this diagram that this is still the preganglionic axon that's coming from the spinal cord. It's going all the way to the adrenal gland. And so this is a little different in that this is going to directly stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this is kind of the pathway that triggers our hormonal response to the fight or flight, so that we release this hormone into the bloodstream, wherever the norepinephrine and epinephrine come in contact to cells that have receptor for them, they're going to cause an effect, usually excitatory. So we have discrete effects from the sympathetic to ramp up very directly the effects and this force of contraction and rate of contraction for things like the heart, rate of respiration, depth of respiration for the lungs. But then we get a more general response in the body through the hormonal release through this adrenal pathway. And again, there's no separate ganglia or second axon for that one. That's the only one of the autonomic system setups that I'm aware of that doesn't have that 2 neuron chain on the motor side of things. All right, so let's look at each of those a little bit more closely. Again, the sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain just refers to that whole column on either side of the spinal cord where we have those clusters of ganglia that are all kind of linked together. Let's look at this next picture here. So this is these are actual dissection pictures. So if you look at the illustration over to the left, they basically have this box that what's shown in the picture is essentially the part of the body that's right behind the heart. So if we took the heart out, cut it away from the vessels that feed into the heart, this is kind of what we're left with. So we've got these really large blood vessels. This big thickest one is the descending aorta. So the blood's going to come out the top of the aorta and then basically travel down. So this is blood flow for the lower half of the body, essentially coming out of this artery here. And then we have a big vein on the side. And then essentially to the lateral side of that vein, I believe you're looking at the vertebrae themselves. And then all of these other things are nerve branches. And so they've done a great job of really cleanly dissecting this so you can kind of see how these things are organized. And so over here, you see the ribs. So in between all these individual nerve branches, you see the ribs. And so I think where these ganglia are located is basically right where the rib is meeting the vertebrae. So just in front of that. And this kind of swelling in the central portion, those are your ganglia. So that's where the cluster of neuronal cell bodies are. And then all of these other things are basically just connecting passageways for the different axons to travel in. Think about like a highway intersection, how you have the flyovers. And that's kind of how this is organized. We don't want to have to just stop and then make a left turn and wait at the light. We kind of have these loopy, curvy kind of pathways so that these different axons, either coming or going to that ganglia, have a way to kind of more seamlessly kind of flow either up or down from one vertebral level to the next, or just medial to lateral to try and send that message out to the rest of the body. So these are the sympathetic trunks for this one half of this body. You'll see some other terms in here. We have a gray ramus and we have a white ramus. So the white ramus, if you follow that little line, is essentially kind of this part in here. That's going to be the myelinated axon that is leaving that ganglia, or coming. It should be coming into that ganglia. Actually, it should be looping around because the myelinated one is the one going from the spinal cord to the ganglia. The gray ramus is going to be the axons that are leaving that ganglia because they're unmyelinated, so they're gray. They don't show up as white per se. And you can't really see the color on this very clearly. It all looks kind of pinkish to me. So it is a little hard to tell what's gray and what's white, but that's kind of what those two rami refer to. So these white rami communicantes are the myelinated ones. They're the preganglionic axons. The gray rami communicantes are the postganglionic axons coming from there. So that's kind of how that's set up. So that's one way that we send those messages through that sympathetic trunk organization. And this is the best way for us to let one signal to excite or to cause effect to be able to disperse very widely. So this really helps a lot with that divergence of signaling. let me go back. If I have a message coming out to these ganglia and I want it to go to multiple organs that have branches coming off of the 3 spinal nerves above and the 3 spinal nerves below, essentially the body is set up so I have pathways where I can disperse that signal vertically, kind of up and down through that sympathetic trunk, and then they can project out horizontally to go to whichever organ they go to, whether it's, like I say, whether it's going to the lungs, whether it's going to the stomach, whether it's going to the intestines. And in most cases, when we look at these that are going to these digestive organs, they're going to turn down the activity, quit making that secretion, quit sending so much blood to those organs. We have a higher priority now, and that's fueling the muscles, fueling the skin so that we can stay cool and keep fighting and keep fleeing whatever we're doing. So that's our kind of like our fire alarm setup. If you think about like a high-rise building, if we only set off when you set off the fire alarm, it only alerted the floor where the fire was, everybody above that would kind of be in trouble, right? The people below it can still probably get out, but everybody above it really needs to know. And so that vertical ability to send that message high to low gives us a lot better ability to alert everybody that needs to know about it, that something stressful is happening and we need to figure out how the body needs to respond with that.
Hey, Craig, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So when it comes to like hyper or hypo active organs, is the sympathetic nervous system what controls those types of like organ dysfunctions?
I mean, yeah, to a degree. I mean, you're going to have hormonal effects too, that are going to influence those things. So you can't have that, you know, if you have like a thyroid gland, let's say, you can be hyperthyroid, you can be hypothyroid. The thyroid gland is going to release stuff potentially in response to the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system, but there's also hormonal control too. And that hormonal control is going to influence that activity as well. So it has more than one thing, but yeah, it could certainly be a cause of this. If you're not getting adequate stimulation, or if you're getting too much stimulation and it's suppressing the activity of an organ. Again, it kind of depends on which organ it is. When we look at the gut versus like the heart and the lungs, the effects in these two systems are basically reversed, because the heart and the lungs, when we're resting and digesting, don't need to do much, but when we're fighting or fleeing, they do need to do a whole lot. And the GI tract's the opposite. So, all right. So the ones that, the branches of the sympathetic nervous system that don't use that chain, that sympathetic trunk, are referred to as our prevertebral ganglia. And so that's all these ganglia that are associated with the nerves that are listed on this slide. Again, these are different splanchnic nerves. They're not the pelvic splanchnic nerves. Those are the ones for the sacral part of the parasympathetic side of things. So these are all mostly going to be thoracic or lumbar level. And again, mostly all of our GI organs, stomach, liver, kidneys, small intestine, upper part of the large intestine, pancreas, things like that. All right, let me go to this next one. And so we've talked about the spinal nerve pathways. These are going to be the ones that are going to control like the eyes and the heart, sweat glands, things of that nature. The postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway are going to be our sympathetic trunk. The splanchnic nerve pathway are the prevertebral ones that I just mentioned, that are mostly going to all those digestive organs primarily. And then the adrenal medulla pathway is the one that doesn't use the two neurons. It's going from the spinal cord neuron, sending an axon all the way to the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is basically right on top of the kidney. But that's where we're going to release the hormones of norepinephrine and epinephrine to cause a whole body response.
Is there an adrenal gland on each kidney?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. So here's our chain ganglia. So we've got our neuron in the spinal cord in that lateral horn, motor neuron. It's going to send its axon out. It's going to synapse in the ganglia, and then it can go to whichever organ it's trying to cause an effect on. And you can see on these lower levels that you've got the ability to kind of have some communications up and down. But then again, kind of like I mentioned with the kind of flyover system on the freeways where you don't have to stop and make a turn at the light, we can just kind of take the off ramp and curve it around. That's kind of how these axons are set up. So they can make this big wide sweeping turn going through these different rami to then connect either to the ganglia above or the ganglia below within that chain. And that's really how we're able to kind of send messages vertically to all those different organs really quickly, so we can kind of have a fast response. Our ones going to the heart, again, we're going to want to increase heart rate. We're going to want to increase the force of contraction. We want to beat faster, and we want to beat more, pump out more blood with each beat. So that's our second type of pathway. Again, it does utilize these ganglia. It's just a little bit different in how it's kind of organized than the previous one that we looked at. So both of these two types use that chain ganglia. The prevertebral ones don't. So this is the ones going to like the gut. So we've got our neuron here in the spinal cord in that lateral horn. The axon goes out. It has to pass through where all those ganglia are, but it doesn't stop. There's no synapse there. So that ganglia keeps going, and then it's going to synapse in a ganglia that is a little bit away from that sympathetic chain, from where that trunk of linked ganglia are. But it still has a ways to go before it gets to the organ that it's trying to innervate, even though this diagram doesn't show it that way. The diagram is showing it with a much longer axon here and a shorter axon in green. But it's just because they're trying to show the organ not anatomically correct where it is in relation to it. This is the sympathetic side, so the preganglionic axon is shorter than the postganglionic axon. And then here's our adrenal medulla one. Again, it's got to go through that kind of exchange area where those ganglia are, so they can connect where it needs to, but it's just one continuous axon that's going all the way to that adrenal gland to cause it to stimulate it to release, again, norepinephrine and epinephrine. All right, so this term mass activation is kind of like pulling the fire alarm and letting everybody in the building know what's going on. That's what we like about the sympathetic response when we are in a fight or flight situation. It really helps to make us more alert from a vision standpoint. Our hearing is enhanced a little bit. Oftentimes we'll quit the rest and digest stuff. So things like our salivary glands, you'll get that cotton mouth kind of feeling sometimes when you're very anxious and nervous, because we're like, hey, don't worry about eating anything right now. We don't need to worry about making spit. We need to worry about making sweat. We need to worry about really identifying where the threat is. We need other things to be working a lot more than our salivary glands. And so, if you think about a sport, I think baseball and softball are kind of the sport that comes to mind with this, because it's when you're at bat, when you're going up to that plate and getting ready for your turn, you've been sitting in the dugout waiting for your turn. The tension and pressure is building. You want to be successful when you get up there. You're getting a big sympathetic nervous system response. A lot of times you'll feel like you might need to pee. You're getting very anxious. You feel kind of shaky and jittery, especially if it's like end of the game. We've got a person on base. It's all up to me, 2 outs. It's not fight or flight, but it is a contrived fight or flight kind of situation. Depends on how serious you take your sport. But the more we can have those things ramped up, the easier it is for us to identify what kind of pitch is coming in, how quickly we need to accelerate that bat to make contact. If our vision is working better, we can more accurately place that bat. If our cerebellum system is working a little bit better to be kind of heightened and everything, we'll have just a little bit better balance, reaction, coordination. And then again, if we do put that ball into play, having that heart rate higher, having that blood pressure higher helps us then be able to race down the line to first base or second or whatever the case might be. So, it definitely is helpful to have all these effects taking place with all these multi-organs that are going to help us respond to that situation. All right, 9:09. So I think we're doing pretty good time-wise. So we've got plexuses. Remember, we had plexuses on the somatic side for the motor system in particular, where we had the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus and the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus, where we have these different branches of spinal nerves that kind of split off and then kind of reorganize themselves as distinct peripheral nerves. We have plexuses in with these autonomic ganglia as well. And so if you look at for autonomic plexuses, we've got, it's basically groupings of sympathetic postganglionic axons. So the ones after we've already had that first synapse, the parasympathetic preganglionic axons. So again, if we look at our length of our axons, the sympathetic has that first synapse closer to the spinal cord. So then in these ganglia out here, these plexuses out here, we've got those longer axons that are traveling to the organ that they're trying to innervate, that are basically organized and grouped with the preganglionic axons for the parasympathetic ones. The ones for the parasympathetic haven't gotten to their synapse yet when they're organized in these plexuses. And then we're also going to have information going the other way, coming in from these organs, from the heart, from the lungs, from the intestines, from the esophagus, from the stomach, sending us that sensory information back up to know really what parasympathetic response do I need. Is there something in my gut that I need to digest? I need to know that information so that I can do it appropriately. Is there some blood pressure problem going on? I need to sense that so I can change my heart rate or force of contraction to kind of modify that blood pressure response. So we do see these different clusters of plexuses that are controlling the organs that are kind of at the level that they talk about. So that's kind of what you see in here. What you don't see in this area is one that a lot of sportscasters will often refer to when people get the wind knocked out of them, so to speak. They're like, oh, he took a shot to his solar plexus. Have anybody heard that term? It's not really a thing. I've never seen an anatomy book that has the solar plexus listed in it, and I've looked. I don't know where that term comes from, but these are the plexuses. And certainly when you get hit in the gut like that, it's going to put tension on all these nerves and kind of shock those organs that they're tied into to a degree. But the main effect of getting hit in the gut like that is that it's going to, essentially, if we compress that abdominal cavity, it's going to push up into the diaphragm, and that forces air out of our lungs. So people feel initially really short of breath. They've lost more of their remaining lung capacity when they get hit with that forceful blow in the abdomen. But I don't see solar plexus listed on this slide. And like I say, I've looked in 3 or 4 different anatomy books, and it's not really a thing to my knowledge. So don't say that. All right. Let's look at, we'll look at these plexuses. I just pulled up kept active a couple of these slides on these different autonomic plexuses just to kind of talk about how they're going to work a little bit and how they coordinate with each other. So when we look at the cardiac plexus, sympathetic, we want that heart rate to beat faster. We want it to beat stronger. We're going to raise the blood pressure because we're pumping so much more blood out so much more quickly. Parasympathetic, slow the rate down, slow that force of contraction down. And normally at rest, if you detach all the nerves from the heart that are trying to stimulate it or influence it, these parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves, the heart rate will be about 100 beats a minute. Most of us don't have a heart rate of 100 beats a minute. Most people are significantly lower than that for their resting heart rate. The more below 100 it is, the more you tend to be thought of as having a higher amount of parasympathetic tone regulating that heart rate response. And so if you have people that have higher levels of fitness, especially cardiovascular fitness, with each beat of the heart, they can pump out a lot more blood than somebody that doesn't have as well conditioned of a heart. Think just like lifting weights. If your muscles are stronger, you can lift heavier weight. If your heart is stronger, you can pump out more blood with each beat. And so to supply a given amount of blood, if you can pump more with each beat, you don't have to beat nearly as high. Your rate can be a lot slower and you'll still have the same volume of blood pushed out because you're pumping a whole lot more with each beat. So if we look at like a heart that can pump 100 milliliters of blood in a minute versus a heart that can only pump 50 milliliters of blood, or excuse me, with each beat. So 50 milliliters with a beat or 100 milliliters with a beat. If I pump 50 milliliters with each beat, I have to go 100 beats to pump as much blood as the heart that's pumping 100 milliliters with each beat. It only needs to pump 50 times. So that rate is directly tied into that. And again, people that have really, really low heart rates at rest are referred to as having a high amount of parasympathetic tone. Somebody whose resting heart rate is more like 85 or 90, they're going to tend to have more sympathetic activity. The parasympathetic is still winning, so it's still below 100 because you still are in that rest or digest phase, but it's not that much. And you know, certainly things, caffeine in particular can have a big effect on your heart rate and making it go faster. It basically mimics what these sympathetic hormones of epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to do in increasing that heart rate. So that will alter what the person's normal heart rate would be, you know, if you're taking in a good amount of caffeine. So cardiac plexus, again, pulmonary plexus, kind of set up the same way. If we don't need a lot of airflow, we're going to reduce the diameter of the bronchioles and the trachea. That smooth muscle there will kind of constrict a little bit and be narrower. We're not going to breathe as deeply. We're not going to breathe as rapidly. If we do need to move a lot of air in times of fight or flight, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to try and dilate everything up, open up those lung spaces, and start triggering the diaphragm to contract more regularly, intercostal muscles in the ribs to contract more regularly so that we can get that breathing rate and movement of air up a whole lot faster. All right, I kind of skipped over the function on these other plexuses, mostly because as PT people, we need to know more about what the heart and lung are doing than what the gut's doing. But again, we're going to have those similar effects, except they're going to be reversed from the lungs. Fight or flight response, we don't want a lot of blood flow or a lot of activity in the gut. Rest and digest, we do want a lot of blood flow and activity of secretions and smooth muscle contraction in the gut so we can do the digestive processes. All right, I'm going to take a drink before we talk about these neurotransmitters. I think I'm going to stand up too. See ya. Okay. Did you know I have a high-low desk? I have a high-low desk. And my office is really hot and my fan broke, so I'm not happy about that. Try to wear a cool shirt, but it's not working. Teaching gets you, it's a sympathetic thing. I don't know, I'm just getting too amped up. All right, so we talked about acetylcholine. That's our most common neurotransmitter for all these different synapses. We're going to have it, especially in the peripheral. It's the most common one that we're going to release in the peripheral nervous system. Cells that respond or release acetylcholine are referred to as cholinergic. So it doesn't have to do with the colon. It's got an H there. That's the choline part. So acetylcholine, if they work that way, that's cholinergic. That's its mechanism of action. They respond to acetylcholine or release acetylcholine. All of the first neurons that in that ganglia, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, always release acetylcholine. The postganglionic axon, when it gets to whatever organ it's trying to release on, in the parasympathetic side, it's going to release acetylcholine. In the sympathetic side, sometimes it releases acetylcholine, but more commonly it's going to release that norepinephrine. And so their effects are usually going to be excitatory. There are some times when acetylcholine will inhibit. And again, when we talk about exciting or inhibiting, it refers to how much of a change in polarity is it going to cause to that next neuron's resting membrane potential. And we'll get into this more with physiology next semester, but essentially nerve cells are believed to have a resting membrane potential of about -70 millivolts. So if we get an excitatory message, that's going to make that resting membrane potential be less negative. So if we get just one little discrete message, then maybe it goes from -70 to -68. If we keep sending that message, then it goes to -63, 62, 70, or excuse me, 58. When it hits -55, that opens up a whole bunch of voltage gated channels. And then we have a bunch of positive ions that are going to rush into that neuron and flip the polarity and depolarize that cell. So it actually goes up to being positive for a brief period of time. And that's what starts that action potential. If we have an inhibitory message, that means that resting membrane potential that was -70, if a neuron sends an inhibitory message, it's going to go down. So it's going to become even more negative. And so that means that if it goes from -70 to -80, then in order to get that cell to depolarize, we have to send that many more excitatory messages to cause it to flip. So it just becomes harder to depolarize if we also have some inhibitory messages coming in. And a lot of our cells do have a mixture of excitatory and inhibitory messages. And it's kind of like, you know, a scale. If I'm getting a whole lot of inhibitory ones, well, it's going to be really hard to fire. If I'm getting more excitatory ones, then it's going to make it easier to fire. You'll also see these terms muscarinic and nicotinic. And they've identified that these acetylcholine receptors will also respond to these two other chemicals. It's not that our body necessarily produces either one of them. Muscarine is found in, I think, the muscarine grapes. I think there's some type of grape. And then nicotine, obviously, in tobacco. These refer to basically just a different way that the receptor opens gates for the cell. The nicotinic ones are direct. So I'm going to have a gate that's closed. If acetylcholine comes in and binds to the receptor on that gate, it's going to directly cause it to open. And now some ions can come in to cause some sort of change, whether it's excitatory or inhibitory. When I have muscarinic ones, it's what's referred to as a G protein. So it uses a secondary messenger. So again, I've got my gate. All right, my acetylcholine comes in and binds there, but rather than opening up this gate right here, this one basically just has another like internal messenger that is released and then like opens up the back door. So it's essentially like there's a knock on the door, oh, I've got a package for you, and you're like, okay, bring it around back. So it opens up a gate, but it's not a direct way. So that's the difference. And we'll get into that again. That's more of a physiology thing that we'll talk about next semester, but that's all that it refers to. It's just how does the gate open up, and it's different between those two. All right, with our sympathetic ones, our preganglionic axons are always going to release acetylcholine. It's always going to be excitatory. The postganglionic axon can release either norepinephrine, which is usually excitatory. Occasionally it's inhibitory. And it's going to bind to, if we release norepinephrine, then it binds not to a cholinergic receptor, not to a muscarinic or nicotinic receptor, but to an adrenergic, meaning adrenaline. So those are kind of the four different receptor types that we're looking at. Cholinergic, muscarinic and nicotinic are types of cholinergic receptors. Adrenergic are a totally different type. Muscarinic and nicotinic are both going to respond to acetylcholine, but a adrenergic is only going to respond to that adrenaline-related compound of norepinephrine. All right, so here's our different kind of ways that these are set up. Here's our parasympathetic. It's always the same. Both neurons release acetylcholine. The neuron in the ganglia always has nicotinic receptors. The tissue that is being targeted by that is always going to have muscarinic receptors. But both synapses, the neurotransmitter that's being used is acetylcholine. So we have, this is the neuron, one at the top of the image is the one in the spinal cord. It's going to go out to its peripheral ganglia. That's, if it's parasympathetic, it's somewhere fairly close to the organ that it's trying to influence. It releases acetylcholine that binds to these nicotinic receptors that then excite this neuron in the ganglia to then try to excite the target cell in most cases. Again, if we think about the stomach, I'm trying to cause muscle contraction in the stomach. I'm trying to cause secretions of enzymes and digestive juices in that GI tract. We want to excite it here. We want to excite it here. Get the gut working. It's parasympathetic. Our sympathetic pathways, this first one is identical to what we see with the parasympathetic. And so these are going to be the type that control blood vessel dilation for like skeletal muscle and the skin. Things are going to help us respond to the heat of the moment. It's going to be excitatory in both cases here. And it's the exact same way that it's organized. The first one uses acetylcholine. We've got a nicotinic receptor on the ganglion neuron. We release acetylcholine at the end of that axon. The target tissue has muscarinic receptors that also respond to that acetylcholine to excite and ramp those things up. So identical there. This second pathway is probably the most common of the sympathetic ones. So we have acetylcholine at the first one. We've got that nicotinic receptor at the ganglion neuron, wherever it is. But then at the distal end, at that second neuron, it's going to release norepinephrine. And that norepinephrine is going to be bound by adrenergic receptors to cause whatever effect we're after. And again, in some cases, this might be inhibitory. In some cases, it might be excitatory. If it's going to something like the heart, we want it to be excitatory. If it's going to something like the gut, we want it to be inhibitory because it's sympathetic. And then this is our exception to the rule. We don't have that second neuron. We have the spinal cord neuron directly connecting with the adrenal medulla cell. It's acetylcholine. It's a muscarinic receptor. It's stimulatory. So it's going to excite things. So those are kind of the four different types that we have. Again, this middle one on the sympathetic is kind of the most common. This one is the most rare because it just goes to the adrenal gland. And then this one is basically set up identical to the parasympathetic with it. So sympathetic is definitely harder. Parasympathetic is a lot more consistent and easier to think about. All right, so again, these two systems balance each other out. They complement each other. They kind of cause very much opposite effects in most of the organs that they're going to influence. And just like a resting muscle tone, there's always kind of a balance. You're never really having one of them completely shut off and one of them completely turned on. They're both kind of turned on. It's just kind of which one is working a little bit harder at any given point in time. But they do kind of always kind of keep things running in the body, and they need each other. If we don't have one side working, then it can cause some problems. There are some conditions where they'll try to decrease some of the activity of some of these sides of it. I know for like hyperhidrosis, which is like excess sweating, sometimes for like the palms and the feet and stuff, they'll actually cut the sympathetic nervous system branch so that way we cannot increase sweating in those areas, so we can kind of not get that sensation. There's some other ones too where they'll selectively try to cut one or the other so that it doesn't have overriding influence and correct some physiology problem that somebody might be having. But most of our organs are going to be set up with dual innervation. So they are influenced by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But we do have some that are only influenced by the sympathetic, not very many. So most are set up where these divisions are going to oppose each other, where we're going to see antagonistic effects. Parasympathetic makes your heart rate slow down. Sympathetic makes it speed up. Parasympathetic makes your GI ramp up activity. Sympathetic makes your GI slow down activity. So that's the more typical way that these two systems work with each other. But we do have, in some cases, cooperative effects. And more of those are in the reproductive organs than anywhere. And so for men, parasympathetic activity leads to an erection, but sympathetic is what leads to ejaculation. So you can't have one without the other. You can, but you're not going to be successful with one without the other. Essentially, if the goal is impregnating somebody, you kind of need both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic to work together. And we see similar things with female responses as well, where certain components of the female reproductive tract work in response to sympathetic and other parts work in response to parasympathetic. So cooperative is less common. Antagonistic is by far the more common. So the things that are only controlled by sympathetic is really just going to be those blood vessels primarily, and then sweat. Again, kind of it's a branch of that sympathetic side, but it doesn't use those trunk ganglion pathways as much. And so in this case, it's a matter of how much sympathetic tone do we have. If we're cranking up that sympathetic tone, then we're going to get a bigger response. If we're just kind of keeping it at its baseline level, then we're going to have a more minimal response. But it's not that we have that parasympathetic influence affecting things either. It's just more of that single dial. All right, last little bit, and then we'll take a break. So we do have, again, our autonomic system has to keep everything in balance. And we've talked about things that are more processes, like when we eat. That's not a reflex. I mean, it is driven by reflexes, and we need that sensory information to cause the nervous system response, but it doesn't need to be rapid. It takes a while to digest everything and break it down enough to actually absorb it. So it's not an immediate kind of response. So when we look at this term autonomic reflexes, these are things that we really need to do quickly, or we might have an issue. And blood pressure and heart rate is the easiest one to kind of think of. If you've been lying down and all of a sudden you sit up really quickly, what happens to you? How do you feel? No big deal?
Lightheaded.
Okay, so not uncommon to feel kind of lightheaded and kind of woozy for a second. When we're laying down, it's really easier for blood to make it back to the heart, because our whole body is at one level and the heart's at the same level as the rest of the body. So it's a lot easier for that fluid to flow horizontally in the body. It's not having to deal with gravity. When I sit up all of a sudden, now my heart's pretty high in my body and my head is even higher and my legs are hanging down. And so if I've not had my heart having to beat very hard or having to really maintain a lot of tension in the blood vessels, when I sit up all of a sudden, all that blood, because gravity has an effect on it, will move down in my body. And I'll have a harder time returning a lot of blood to my heart. If I can't get a lot of blood back to my heart, then when my heart contracts and pumps blood out, there's not as much to go up here. And it's a little bit harder to maintain good blood pressure up here. And so we feel a little bit lightheaded for a second. And so these autonomic reflexes, we've got what are called baroreceptors that sense pressure inside our vessels. They'll be like, hey, the pressure is really low in these carotid arteries right now. We need to beat harder and we need to beat faster. Otherwise, we're going to pass out. We also have a protective autonomic reflex that works the opposite way if our blood pressure is too high. We can't afford to let the really small capillaries in the brain rupture by flooding it with too much blood all at once. So if our body senses that our blood pressure is too high, especially up in these carotid vessels, we're going to say, hey, heart, slow down, quit beating so hard. We need to lower that pressure up here. Otherwise, we're going to potentially rupture some small vessels in the brain and cause some strokes and things like that. So we do have these autonomic responses for a number of other organs, but blood pressure is kind of the easiest one to kind of think of, because most of us have had that kind of experience when you either maybe you're squatting down and then you stand up. That's kind of the same deal. When you squat down, maybe you're kneeling and squatting down, working on something, you've kind of put a kink in the tubing behind your knee. And so then when you stand up, all of a sudden it's like, oh, now I've got all this extra area where the blood can flow, and I'm standing totally upright. So all of a sudden we've got a lot of blood going downhill, and we start like, whoa. So we do want that response to be super rapid. If it doesn't respond quickly enough, the body will correct it we'll pass out, essentially. Now we're horizontal. Now it's easy for that blood to get back to the heart, and it's easy for the heart to pump that blood because it's not having to deal with gravity anymore. So that's kind of the fail-safe for the body, which if you hit your head on the way down, that's not a good thing. Or you're not standing up on something that you could fall off of, it's definitely not a good thing. So anytime you feel kind of woozy like that, when you've changed position, try and move your feet and ankles, kind of bounce up and down on your toes. We want to get the muscle contraction kind of helping push that blood back up to the heart. And that'll help that dizziness clear a little bit faster.
So kind of in the same vein, so I work at a job where I sit a lot. And so whenever I need to stretch, and sometimes I will raise both of my arms over my head and kind of get that woozy blackout feeling. Is that kind of the same thing?
I mean, if you're raising your arms up, it'll make the blood really kind of make it back to the heart a little bit easier. That was up here. It might have more to do with, I mean, I don't know if you're bending or anything like that, you could be potentially kind of crimping down on the inferior vena cava that's trying to return the blood from the bottom. So that can be an effect too. And certainly if you're crunched over, then we will kind of pinch down on that vena cava. Or if you're bracing your abdomen too much, you're doing a big Valsalva maneuver, you can kind of compress that inferior vena cava and make it harder for blood to come back up to get into the heart. So it might be related to just some other postural changes, but as far as doing this part, just lifting the arms up, if anything, I would think that would almost help in a way, because your arm, it becomes hard to do arm work because then it's really hard to pump blood out to your fingers. So if you're like trying to do exercises with your hands while your hands are way overhead, they're going to run out of fuel pretty quick because it's really hard to get blood from here up to here when we do that. All right, last little bit, we'll talk about how the bladder works. Pretty exciting. And then we can take a bathroom break. How about that? So again, we need that sensory information, visceral information coming up the nervous system so that the autonomic nervous system knows how to respond. So if you drank a good amount of fluid before class started, maybe about now you've had a chance to process that a little bit. Your bladder starts getting full. The tissue starts stretching. That tension in that smooth muscle of the bladder wall is going to basically send a signal to the spinal cord that says, hey, bladder's getting kind of full. Our brain doesn't really need to be aware of it just yet. It'll connect with an interneuron in that spinal cord, and then it will send out a motor axon that's going to cause two different effects. You're going to have the smooth muscle of the bladder itself is going to start to contract. So the bladder is going to go from being bigger size to a smaller size. And so whatever fluid is in there all of a sudden is under more pressure because we've gone from a big space to a small space, but the amount of liquid inside there is still the same. So that's going to increase that pressure. At the same time that the bladder smooth muscle is starting to contract, we're also going to get an opposite effect at what's called the internal urethral sphincter. So we've got two sphincters that help us control urine flow. And a sphincter is just kind of a circular loop of muscle fiber. So we've got two of them essentially. And so the reflex is to open up the top one. And so when we open up the top one, the only thing stopping us from wetting our pants is that bottom one. And this is when we become aware of the fact that we need to go. is essentially, it's not when the bladder necessarily just gets full. It's when after the bladder is full, we get this reflexive signaling that says, hey, bladder's like, I'm in charge. The nervous system says, I need to get rid of this stuff. So I'm going to contract. I'm going to open up this floodgate, and it's on you to go find a bathroom and to control that second floodgate until you find a safe place to go. And so when you're trying to potty train a kid, they usually don't have good voluntary control of this external sphincter until they're around 2, give or take. So it is really hard to get a kid to be really consistent with bladder control before the age of 2, because neuromuscularly, they're still having a hard time figuring out how to control that external sphincter. And when that internal one opens up, it just goes. Now, once they get beyond that age, unless they've had some sort of, nervous system development glitch, then it becomes probably more of just a psychological thing as much as anything. Our son was potty trained pretty well right about at 2, and I was glad, but you hear horror stories about some kids that just resist it, whether it's just the bladder or just the bowel part. It's too much of a hassle to go to the bathroom when you're wearing a diaper. Might as well just use it. Why do I have it? I can't use it. In any event, that's
So would that be an example of an antagonistic response with the bladder muscle contracting and the sphincter opening?
Well, they're both responding. It'd be more of an excitatory and inhibitory response. So they're both being stimulated by the parasympathetic side of things, because it's rest and digest. It's normal that bladder's full. It's time to empty it. It's just that what we're doing is essentially we're trying to tell that first one to relax, or the sphincter to relax, which is a inhibitory message essentially, because the sphincter, if it's excited, it's going to contract and narrow down. If we're telling it to not contract, we're inhibiting it, it's going to open up. But the bladder wall is excitatory, it's trying to contract. So it's not that they're controlled by opposite parts of the autonomic system. It's opposite effects.
Okay.
All right, so 9:40, let's take about 10 minutes, and then we're gonna talk about the heart. So think about if you need to initiate this reflex, go for it. I'll see you in a few.
Craig, what's the name of the video? Is it Crash?
Crash Course. Yeah, that guy, he has an older series of videos that I think are for like just a biology class. And then I think somebody must have noticed him and helped him produce some of these other ones. It's pretty slickly produced, but it's yeah, the anatomy and physiology series of videos. And so I definitely use them a lot for physiology. I think it's helpful to kind of have his kind of more humorous take on how a lot of these organs function. And then we can kind of go through them and hopefully when I talk through it, it reinforces what he does. So a lot of times I'll kind of play them near the beginning of a given set of content. So we kind of get kind of a big picture overview before we try and get down into the nitty gritty on him. But yeah, I believe he's at the University of Montana, professor up there. And they're all about the same length, about 9 minutes, give or take a little bit. But yeah, any concepts that you feel like you want to have a different listen to or different take on, any organ system, body system that we're going over, he's pretty much got a video for it, either through that series or through the older one. His first name's Hank. I can't remember what his last name is, but I think he's a PhD up there at Montana. All right, well, let's go ahead and jump into the heart. So your quiz next week will be on the heart. So that's kind of our lab focus this week. We'll get into, I think, the heart chapter probably after the next exam. I think it might be the first chapter after the next exam. So we've got your next written exam is a week from today. And so we'll go through the senses on Thursday. So we did the eye and the ear pretty much already. So we'll spend a lot more time kind of talking about sense of smell, sense of taste, and then the different parts of sense of touch on Thursday. And then that's the last new set of concepts. So this whole next test, written exam, is pretty much all the different nervous system stuff. It's kind of the big focus on that one. So, and then like I said, we'll go into heart and lungs, spend a decent amount of time on heart and lungs. And then most of the other organ systems we'll kind of go through at more of a superficial level, just a lot because we're running out of time and we still have a lot of body parts to cover. But they're also the body parts that we typically don't have as much direct effect on when we look at the stomach, the intestines, the liver, the kidneys, all those type of things. So I've got this big model of a heart. They usually say that your heart is about as big as your fist. So here's my fist next to this heart. This is a lot bigger heart than my fist, but that's kind of a ballpark. It does depend on the person and kind of what activity they've done in their past and things like that. So we've got a lot of muscle, and we talked about the different types of muscle when we went over that unit. So we've got skeletal muscle, we've got smooth muscle, and then we've got cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is very much like smooth muscle with a few key differences. One, we've got those branching muscle fibers, which allow the heart to kind of create this circumferential kind of mass of muscle that can basically pull against itself. When we look at skeletal muscle, it's going from point A to point B, and we're trying to cause some sort of movement at a body part. With cardiac muscle, we're trying to move the fluid that's inside the chambers. And so the heart muscle needs to pull against itself to basically shrink its internal space to be able to push the blood out. Now, in addition to the muscle, we need lots of blood vessels to supply that heart muscle. The heart never can stop. It has to work 24/7 and be beating all the time. So we need really good, healthy blood vessels to maintain good perfusion of all that heart muscle, keep it nice and healthy, help it do its job, help it get rid of its waste products when it is working hard, all those type of things. The heart muscle can't just be a big blob of muscle. There's got to be some structure to it. And so there's structure in a couple different ways. We've got structure in what we call the fibrous skeleton of the heart. And so this is basically, it's not bone, but it's a more rigid component largely collagen based, that basically is going to form kind of like a T or a cross. So if we look at where my pens are going, we've got basically a section of connective tissue that goes horizontally that's going to separate the atrias from the ventricles. And then we've got a section of connective tissue running vertically that's going to separate right from left. So kind of when we think about our planes of motion, we've got a transverse plane section of connective tissue to give some form and shape to the heart. And then we've got a sagittal plane as well. Now, close to where that fibrous skeleton is, we're also going to have the valves. And so the valves are also going to be kind of part of that fibrous skeleton. The valves are going to prevent blood from flowing the wrong direction inside the heart. And so they need to be kind of rigid and firm and have a little bit more structure to them to work effectively. If they're too floppy and flexible, then they're not going to be able to seal things off very well. So that's kind of big picture stuff to look at. I've got my slides up for the chapter 11 lab slides for the heart, but I'm not going to work off of it. I'm just going to try and use the model, and then I'll kind of double check myself and make sure I remembered everything. So top and bottom, I'm going to rotate this a little bit. So now you're looking mostly at the right side of the heart, kind of from the side. We've got the superior vena cava, and we've got the inferior vena cava. And these are the two biggest blood vessels that are going to return blood to the heart. The superior vena cava is essentially all the blood that was up in the head, the neck, the arms is going to come in through there. The inferior vena cava is pretty much all the blood returning from the legs, from the gut, from the bowel, bladder, all those type of organs is coming up back that way. So both of those big vessels, what we call the great veins, are essentially going to dump blood into the right atrium. So they're both going to connect directly, even though this one is coming in, it looks like it's coming in, the inferior vena cava coming up from the ventricle. It's actually coming in kind of behind it, and it's going to connect into the right atria. This big section right here, this is kind of more straight on facing you guys, is called the auricle. And so again, the auricle, we also had the ear, is called an auricle, and it kind of looks like an ear if you look at the shape of that. When we had our specimens before we shut down that cadaver lab room, I was shocked on the heart model or the heart specimens how flimsy and flexible and stretchy the auricle was. It's essentially like an overflow chamber. So when we dump a whole bunch of blood back in the heart at once, we've got kind of this extra capacity where it can just kind of stretch out. So it doesn't have a lot of tension on it. It's very easy for blood to fill that space. We do have muscle fiber running through the auricle, in addition to kind of the inner parts of the atria. So when we do contract the atria, it is going to help push that blood down into the ventricle. So we have an auricle on both that are associated and part of both the right and the left atria. But again, it's kind of just reserved capacity. When the heart's working harder and really like during heavy exercise, we're going to have to make more use of that auricle. We have a greater amount of blood that we're pumping in a minute. So we're getting more blood coming back that we need to be able to find space for as that blood cycles through these different chambers. So that's the auricles. I'm going to open up the chambers a little bit so we can kind of see them a little bit better. And hopefully you can see that. I'm going to turn my right atria a little bit. So you can see the underside here. We've got, this little blue hole. That's the underside of the superior vena cava. If I tilt it, you can see in the bottom, we've got a couple holes down there that are blue, indicating that's venous blood coming back in. So one of those is going to be the inferior vena cava. The other one, and I don't think that's accurate where it is, we've got another vessel called the coronary sinus. And so the coronary sinus is the blood that was being used to go to the heart muscle itself also needs to find its way back into the central circulation. So the coronary sinus is where the venous blood from the heart muscle is going to be returned back to the right atria. So all the so-called used blood is going to come into the right atria first. The right atria is going to drain down into the right ventricle, and it's going to go down through what's called the AV valve, and you can see the bottom part of the valve right here. That white portion is the bottom part of that AV valve. We've got an AV valve on the other side right there for the left side. So you can call those valves a couple different things. The easiest one is the right atrioventricular valve and the left atrioventricular valve. It's between those two chambers, but they also have special names as well. And so the right is called the tricuspid. The valve itself has 3 little flaps of tissue that make it up. So it is, and we call those flaps a cusp. So the tricuspid has 3 flaps. On the left side, the AV valve is the bicuspid. It only has 2 flaps. Sometimes the bicuspid is also referred to as the mitral valve. So you'll hear both of those terms. The way to remember which one has 3, which is the tricuspid and which is the bicuspid, we're going to go over the lungs a little bit later. Our lungs, the right lung has 3 sections to it, 3 lobes. The left lung only has 2. And that's the way I keep straight which of the heart valves has which. Right AV valve has 3, just like the right lung has 3 lobes. The left AV valve has 2 cusps, bicuspid, just like the left lung only has 2 lobes. So that's the way that I remember them and keep them straight. So if that helps you, great. The ventricles are much more muscular. They're much thicker. They're the ones that are pumping blood out into the body. So they need to be able to generate a lot more force to push that blood out. The atria, especially if we're upright, gravity is going to help the atria let the blood flow down the valves into the ventricles. But the ventricles are having to push up against the effects of gravity if we're standing up or sitting up. So to get blood out of the heart, we need to generate more force. And again, we're sending blood a lot further distance. When the atria contract, it's just trying to push the blood from here to here. But when the ventricles are trying to contract, it's trying to push the blood from here all the way up to the brain, all the way out to the arms, all the way out to the legs, all the way out to all of our organs. So a lot more muscle, way, way thicker. When we look, let's look at our valves a little bit. I can't really move this much closer, so hopefully you can make it out a little bit. The valves themselves are the top part, and that's going to close off. We've got these little bands that are coming down from the valve that are basically anchoring it to the internal muscle of the ventricle. And we call those the chordae tendineae. So they're basically little tendinous cords. Again, it's going from a muscle to the valve rather than going like from the muscle to the bone like a tendon would for skeletal muscle. But it's essentially serving the same, well, it doesn't serve the same function. I'll take it back. The function of the chordae tendineae is really to prevent the valve from reversing itself. So think about like an umbrella that gets turned inside out. If it does that, it doesn't work very well. And same thing with these valves. If we don't have these chordae tendineae, when the ventricles contract and try to push the blood uphill, that action is what should shut those AV valves. So the AV valves are pointing down like this. When the ventricles push blood up, those valves are going to shut like this and block that flow of blood because we don't want the blood to go from ventricle to atria. We want the blood to go from ventricle out of the heart. And if those AV valves don't shut, then it's not going to work well. And so if that chordae tendineae is broken or overstretched, then instead of that valve shutting, it's going to invert. And now some of that blood is going to go from the ventricle back up to the atria. And then it means the heart's not going to pump very well. It can also increase the risk of getting blood clots because the blood kind of stays in the heart too long and starts kind of clumping together a little bit. Between both the atria and the ventricle, we're going to have what's called the septum. You can't really see the atrial septum on the interatrial septum because we've got these big vessels in the way. but this band right here is essentially the septum between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And so it's the wall, it's the middle wall. You know, think about, you have a duplex and you have a shared wall in the middle. That's essentially the septum between those two living spaces, is that shared wall. So interatrial septum and interventricular septum, between the ventricles or between the atria. Other things that you can see in this ventricle, you can see how the muscle, the red beefy muscle part, looks kind of wavy a little bit, and it is. They call that the trabeculae carnae. It's just kind of it's not a smooth surface. It is kind of just irregular. And it's just the way that the muscle is kind of organized in there. Now, attached to the bottom of the chordae tendineae, we have a couple little points. And so each section of chordae tendineae is going to have a muscular bump that sticks up that we call the papillary muscle. And so papillary just means nipple shaped. And so that's kind of what it looks like. It's just like a little, if you think about like a little volcano or a nipple, it's just kind of a little pointed section of muscle. And that's the attachment point, essentially, for each branch of the chordae tendineae that would anchor it to the ventricular wall so it doesn't invert itself when we push the blood up against it. In the right atria, assuming your valve is working, when that ventricle contracts, the blood is going to get pushed up, and it goes through this space that just, it has the block, it has plastic there. Otherwise, I could stick my finger all the way up in there. And so this little section is called the conus arteriosus. It's just like a cone-shaped section of the ventricle, and that's where we want the blood to go. It's going to blend in to this big vessel right here. This particular section we call the pulmonary trunk, and then it comes up and it splits and goes right and left. And so we've got this one coming out over here, this one coming out over here. So these are the pulmonary arteries that are coming out of the sides of this pulmonary trunk. This is the aorta. And so the pulmonary trunk and the aorta kind of crisscross and kind of dive around each other a little bit. So you can't see all of that pulmonary trunk. The left side you can see coming out. The right side is kind of tucked underneath both the superior vena cava as well as the aorta. So these pulmonary arteries are the only arteries in the body that don't carry oxygenated blood because we haven't gone to the lungs yet. That's where we're going. So the right side of the heart is blood is gonna come into that right atria through the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. When it contracts, it's gonna push it down to the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it's gonna go up through the conus arteriosus to the pulmonary trunk, and then split off to the pulmonary arteries and go to the lungs. Now that blood is gonna go through all the capillaries that surround the alveoli in the lungs. We're gonna have gas exchange taking place and we'll talk about that when we go over the lung, where we're gonna get rid of the carbon dioxide in the old blood and then pick up fresh oxygen from inside the alveoli and get it into the bloodstream. So that way, when that blood comes back to the heart, now it's oxygenated blood. And so when the blood's coming back into the heart, both sides are going to feed into the left atria, and both lungs have two pulmonary veins that are coming in. So that's these two and these two. But just like the inferior and superior vena cava both come to the right atria, both sets of pulmonary veins are going to come to the left atria. So the left atria is going to store that blood for a split second until it contracts, and then it's going to go down to the left ventricle. Excuse me. Having my office door open because it was getting too hot in here, but then my wife decided to clean her blender from her smoothie, and it was a little loud. So I'll just sweat. I'll sacrifice for you guys. My fan is broken. Are you feeling sorry for me yet? All right, so left ventricle contracts. It's going to go up, and it's going to go up through the aorta. So when we look at the aorta, again, I'm going to close the ventricles so you can kind of see. The aorta is coming underneath. Again, here's our left side of the heart. Coming underneath that pulmonary trunk, we have what's called the arch of the aorta. So just like the McDonald's arches or the St. Louis arch or arches, we'll call it delicate arch. We're in Utah. It's arching off, and then we have these three big vessels that are branching off. We'll talk about that more when we get to the heart. But essentially, these are going to go out to the arms as well as up to the head, or what these vessels are going to do. And then as this aorta keeps going around, then it drops down, and this is that descending aorta. So when we looked at that internal cadaver dissection picture that was showing the sympathetic trunks, we saw that descending aorta. That's where it's coming down. And so it's going to continue on and supply blood to the whole lower half of the body. So that's kind of our big vessels. That's kind of our 4 chambers. We've got a few other structures that you need to be aware of. In between where the septum is, between the right and left ventricles, we have some primary blood vessels that are coming down through that area. We'll talk about a few of those blood vessels. And then we've also got a few other kind of indentations, kind of where this, where these chambers are separated. So let me scroll ahead on my slides so I can make sure I get my terminology right. I want to be consistent with the book, and then we'll come back to the pericardium. All right. All right, so there's going to be an indentation where that septum is. The septum is going to be kind of the internal inner wall, but in between the muscular sections of the ventricle, we have the interventricular sulcus. So it is slightly indented there. And then separating the atrias from the ventricles, we have what's called the coronary sulcus. So again, kind of an indented area. And those indented areas are a nice kind of little protected kind of gutter, so to speak, for these big blood vessels to kind of be a little bit protected, so they're not quite so much on the surface. When we look at the right side of the heart, coming off of the bottom of the aorta, essentially the heart gets first dibs on the fresh blood. So we've had our blood flow through the right side of the heart, out to the lungs, came back into the left atria, went to the left ventricle, and then went out the aorta. As it's leaving and going out the aorta to go to the rest of the body, that's where all the blood vessels that are going to supply the heart with its blood are going to branch off. So like I say, it gets first dibs. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't eat, nothing eats, essentially. It needs its blood first. So coming off the right side, we've got the right coronary artery coming right down through here. As it gets down towards the bottom, it's going to kind of branch and run medially, kind of underneath the heart. Let me back up just a touch. And that part that comes underneath is called the marginal artery. So those are really the only two on the right side that I want you to be aware of. Right coronary artery, and then the branch that kind of give blood to the underside of the right ventricle is the marginal artery. Coming off the left side, we've got a small little section that is called the left coronary artery, and then it splits pretty quickly. They've changed this part coming down vertically, kind of in that coronary, that interventricular sulcus. They used to call this one the left anterior descending. So sometimes you'll see that term, LAD, left anterior descending. The more common name for it now, I think, is the interventricular artery, or the anterior interventricular artery, kind of just naming it by where it is on the muscle itself. So you will see that referred to a couple different ways. This one is what's also commonly called the widowmaker. So when somebody gets a blockage in that vessel, because it is supplying the vast majority of the muscle of the left ventricle, and the left ventricle is the part of the heart that pumps blood out to the rest of the body. if we get a blood clot or we get narrowing in that artery that cuts off blood flow to that bottom part of the heart, and that heart tissue dies and doesn't function well anymore, then the whole heart's not going to function well. So this is it's called the widowmaker because blockage, a heart attack in that vessel will often kill people. So that's that one there. Coming off pretty early on, again, this little small section is technically considered the left coronary artery. We'll have a branch that comes out laterally at the top and comes around and basically wraps around kind of the back side of the heart. And that's called the circumflex. So it's kind of going circularly around the heart. So that's how I kind of remember that one. So the circumflex artery is this one coming around the back side there. What else? Let me see what else I've forgotten to talk about. Let's talk about the pericardium, and then we'll stop there and let you guys take your quiz, and then we'll finish up. Just next time we'll talk a little bit about the conduction system, how we get the heart muscle to contract, and then we'll just kind of do some more active learning stuff for lab for Thursday. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides because I don't have a pericardium on this model to kind of show you how the pericardium is organized. And we talked about the pericardium earlier when we talked about the different membrane layers and stuff like that in the heart too. So let me share my screen real quick. All right, so pericardium, it's on the perimeter of the cardium. So it's the surrounding membranous tissue that's going to protect the heart. So when we looked at all of our other serous membrane layers, we have the visceral layer and we have the parietal layer. The visceral layer is the one that's right on top of the organ. The parietal layer is the one that is a little bit further away. That's usually kind of lining the body cavity itself. With the heart, we have an additional layer too. And so the fibrous pericardium is really just a lot of collagen. Structurally, it's very similar to like the dura mater going around the brain, very similar to some of our aponeuroses, kind of tendinous tissues like the IT band. It's really pretty hard to damage it. It's pretty tough. So it's the biggest protective layer that gives it the most rigidity, and the heart's really critical to protect. If you break a rib or something, this pericardium would at least give you a little bit of ability to protect the heart from puncturing right through. If we just had a more pliable, soft kind of layer, it would be a lot easier for a sharp object to kind of penetrate in there. So that fibrous pericardium is mostly collagen, very whitish in color, and it is kind of leathery feeling. The inner layers of the pericardium are the ones that are going to produce the lubricating fluid. They're going to glide against each other when the heart contracts. We don't want them to rub a whole lot. And so we do have a parietal layer, and then we have a visceral layer. So let me show the image here. So here's what we're talking about, right in the middle. And this is kind of a good close-up up here. So if we look at this little inset picture at the very top, you've got the fibrous pericardium, and then on the inner side of that fibrous pericardium, that's where the parietal pericardium is going to be. And then the visceral pericardium is directly on top of the actual muscular wall of the heart. So the visceral pericardium is also thought of as the epicardium. So basically the outermost layer of the heart muscle itself. The middle muscular layer of the heart wall is going to be the myocardium, myo meaning muscle. And then the most inner lining of the heart is going to be the endocardium. So again, we have those similar terms. The epi, we don't have peri this time. Well, we have pericardium as the whole thing in general. But we have, for a lot of those tissue layers, we have the epi, the peri, and the endo, kind of the same thing. We've got the epicardium, which is essentially the visceral pericardium. The actual contractile part of the heart muscle is the myocardium. And then the part that's in contact with the blood, in contact with the valves, that's going to be the endocardium. So those are kind of our three heart layers. and then the different components of the pericardium. So I think we'll stop there. It's 10:20ish, so I'll let you guys get going on your quiz. And then, like I say, we'll go over how the nervous system affects the heart and how the heart kind of sends its electrical signals to itself next time. And then the rest of lab next week, we'll let you guys kind of work on identifying all these heart structures to kind of help get ready for that quiz. So I think the quiz is ready to go for you guys. And I'll stay on the Zoom. Just let me know if you have questions, just put them in the chat box. If you don't have questions, once you're finished with the quiz, just head out and take a little breather before you get going on intro, I guess. Okay? Any questions or concerns? All right, very good. So I'll pull my chat up so I can see that in case anybody has a question. But otherwise, you should be good to start your quiz. I think Allison's probably done, so she may
Oh.
still be on there. So if it's personal, you might want to wait, but just more class-wise, then we should be good.
Okay. The only one I gonna ask about question number 2
Uh-huh.
of the quiz, and it was about the semicircular canal.
I had it open and then I just closed it out, which I don't know why I did, because I figured you were going to ask me something
Yeah.
about that.
You're good.
It's the one that asks if it's an organ of equilibrium, senses linear movement, thin, semi-transparent oval membrane.
Uh-huh.
So isn't the semicircular canal is about the movement of the head, or am I no? Does it play a part of that?
So it's going to sense angular motion, rotational type motions. The linear movement part is really more the
The mouth, the mouth.
utricle and the saccule.
Okay.
So those two sense kind of more horizontal or vertical acceleration and deceleration. The
Okay.
semicircular canals are more about the 3 planes. Am I somersaulting in a sagittal plane? Am I cartwheeling? Or am I
Makes
spinning
sense.
around in a circle?
Makes sense.
So-
Yep.
So they're
Got it.
both, I would say, I mean, both of those are organs of equilibrium, but as far as true linear motion, that's more the saccule and the utricle.
Okay. Yeah, that was my question. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
My question's number 6.
Okay. Let me scoot forward here so I can see it.
I was looking at it so hard trying to figure out if you were going for the posterior cavity or the iris.
Yeah, it's supposed to be the anterior cavity is what the key has for it.
Oh,
And so I think it's highlighting all that green space or
mm,
teal space. So it's including both the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber.
I see. Oh,
Because
yeah.
it's not just the pupil part, it's also kind of the space. So yeah, they put that green in the space, which is a little confusing because it's not a structure, it's just a space.
Yeah, that's all good. It should have been posterior chamber if I was going to choose that anyway.
So,
Okay, thank you.
all right.
See ya.
Okay.